Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Hey, welcome to the show. It's The Law Show here on CL 650. I'm Zach Spencer, and today we're talking about immigration law, and it's been a good conversation so far. Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher are here from MKS in Yaletown in downtown Vancouver. Now, we are going to get to the employer compliance because that's a big part of what you do with getting people across the border for work. But we also want to finish off on this Citizenship Act. And so there's changes in order to become a citizen. You have to be in the country for, well, we talked before about the permanent resident card. It's 2 years out of 5 you have to be here. So for citizenship, is it different?
Yeah, it's 4 out of 6. So you've got to be here 4 out of a 6-year period. And during those...
And is it the permanent resident, is it a cumulative number?
It's also cumulative.
Okay.
Yeah. So 4 out of 6 years. And during the 4 years that you use, you have to actually be physically in the country for 6 months, for 50% of the time, and if necessary, you're supposed to have filed your taxes during that. So those were all new requirements brought in last year by the Conservatives. So that's a big change from what it used to be. Have to only be in Canada 1,095 days, or 3 out of a 4-year period, which is a higher percentage. Actually, it was 75% of the time, but over a much shorter period. And a lot of people felt that that was far too short, because you think about it, a 3-year time period, and you qualify to become a Canadian citizen, you wouldn't even finish the bachelor's degree in that time. When you think about how short that is, actually. And we had, I remember when Hong Kong was going through the change, we had a lot of applicants coming over. We had a crazy system set up at the time, just to go a little bit off topic, in which you could set up an immigrant trust, totally legal. Under Revenue Canada allowed you to set up an immigrant trust, which the Conservatives got rid of. But you were allowed to set up a trust where you could put your money in trust and you wouldn't pay tax on that for 5 years. Come to Canada, stay here for 3 years, get your Canadian citizenship, leave, have Canadian citizenship, and never have paid tax.
On that money that's in the trust.
Yeah. So that's the
that's
system we
probably
had.
a system that was good to get rid of. Yeah. And it seems to me that, with every government that comes in, it's just this ebb and flow. It goes too far one way, maybe it goes too far the other way. Is that what you historically see?
My opinion is 100% that way. I think what we've seen is a government, with the changes, and Gord might disagree with me on this in terms of what's going on with the Citizenship Act, but the Liberals have come forward and said they're going to make some changes. I think some of the changes, as we talked about earlier, the stripping of citizenship is a good change to the Liberals, but I think they are loosening up on some of the other requirements that the Conservatives brought in that I think a lot of people out there would say weren't too draconian. Expecting somebody to be here 4 years out of 6 isn't asking a lot. The U.S., it's 5 years. I don't think it's that extreme.
And in the last segment, we talked about the citizenship and second-class citizens, and your argument was that if you're a Canadian, you're Canadian. So let's make it maybe a little bit harder to become a Canadian. It's and then we're done. Once you're a Canadian, you're done. So 4 out of 6. What is it?
Well, now
it's 4 to 6 now.
Yeah.
It used to be 3 out of 4.
Yeah.
And now they're talking
about putting it back to 3 out of 4.
Okay.
3 out of 5. 3 out of 5. They're changing
3 out of 5.
So they're even actually giving you more time.
Yeah.
But and I think it's unfair to when describing that, to tie that into the investor trust funds. People would be upset with investor trust funds regardless of the time frame of the citizenship.
The difference is you would get the time period
tax,
of 3 years. You wouldn't get any tax. You get your citizenship and pay no tax.
So one of the
other changes that they're going to make too, though, are the language requirement.
Yeah.
You're still going to be, going to be a basic requirement.
But what is that? What is the language requirement?
Well, the way it's written in the law was that you have to have an adequate knowledge of English or French. And so that was generally tested by writing the citizenship test. They changed that under the law to have a formal test, so you would have to get a certain benchmark level.
Is it just oral or is it written too?
Written.
Well, I can tell you a story. You want a personal story
Well,
on this?
no, just
go
just
ahead. Yeah.
And that language test, they would excuse you from it if you were 55 years of age or older. Under the changes to the law last year, they moved that age up to 64. So the Liberals are talking about moving it back to 55. And I'll give you an example of that. We'll both give our examples.
Yeah.
I was dealing with a fellow very recently who's been here for 12 years. He's Asian. He's been here. He went back to China once in the last 12 years, went back for a month. He took the citizenship test. He applied under the old law. And he's going to fail. He's going to fail not because of his knowledge of Canada, but because he doesn't speak English well enough. And he's 48 years old. The reason he doesn't speak English well enough is because he's a cook and he works in the kitchen in his own restaurant.
And everybody's Chinese.
Everybody's Chinese. All his clients are Chinese. That's the way he's worked for 12 years. He's built himself up from doing pot scrubbing, cleaning other people's kitchens, saved his money. He owns his own home now. His child is a Canadian citizen. He owns his own restaurant.
By all measures, he's a success.
By all measures. But he can't speak English, and he won't ever speak English well enough. That's just the way it is for him. Now, he's 48 years old now. He, under this current law, can't become a citizen until 64. He's got to wait almost, 15 more years. So maybe, moving it back to 55 for him makes some sense. I don't see any reason why not to move back. It never made sense to me why it should be 64 as opposed to 55. Other people used to be given credit if you were in Canada as a student or a worker before you obtained your permanent resident status. The old law would give you 1 year's credit for that time towards your 3 of acquiring citizenship. They got rid of that. Well, they're going to bring that back. That seems okay to me. Now we can quibble about the number of years that you should be resident in Canada, but I think the other changes are fine. What's your story?
Well, I just want to jump in quickly now. To play devil advocate here, this is all I'm doing is, people would say, well, you've been here for 12 years, you've invested in a restaurant, you've gotten all these things. Well, couldn't you invest some time to learn a bit of our language so that you integrate better? I mean, there's an argument for that.
Yeah, and he did. He went to language school. On his 1 day off a week, he went to language school. And he has a halting, fundamental, really basic English.
Yeah.
Not enough for the test.
I think what some people don't realize is how hard, and having done this job for as long as we've done it, you realize that there are some people that are good at learning languages. And there are some people that are disaster. They may be dyslexic.
Listen, I was excused from French in school. They were like, this kid's never going to get it. So listen, you go and do an extra study break, and you work on your math and English because French isn't for you.
So you can
ferme la porte on your way out the door.
Don't let it hit you in the derriere.
Exactly. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
So you can see how you end up with clients that will never, they're not going to make that language requirement, not through lack of effort, but just through specific ability. They may be dyslexic. They may not be able to write their own language.
They just may be old.
And so they've got a family, a young family, and they're running their own business, and they've made all those changes. And it seems like, well, we hear so many other success stories where people have learned the language. It isn't that easy. But, if you think about the way it used to be, and when the Liberals were in power, they had, when I started practicing immigration law, I remember going to a meeting with a citizenship officer who was doing the citizenship, had come to speak to the Canadian Bar Association. And I was looking through the rules, and I'm like, well, it says they have to have a certain English ability. I'm like, how do you test that? How is that tested? Well, when they come in to write their citizenship exam, and if they have problems, when we direct them to their seat, and if they have problems following the directions to go sit at a certain seat, then we might investigate a little bit.
Well, I would argue that a written test is much harder than an oral test because you can learn the language, like people say, I have conversational French. Well, you're not going to be able to write French.
Well, what they were doing is the multiple choice test. So they would learn to memorize certain types of questions and then try and memorize after they got enough of them. So people had actually gone to the point of memorizing
keywords,
what the words were and then what the answer would be. And that's how they got around. So they didn't read or write or speak or be able to understand English, and they were getting their citizenship. So, I mean, I think the Conservatives did the right thing in bringing in a language test, and it's done by a third party now. So it's not the government. We don't pay for this. They've got to go get it done by, like, for example,
it's like an audit.
The English language testing service, a TOEFL or something. They can't do TOEFL, but it's IELTS they use. So, I mean, I think that's a fair requirement. I mean, it's up to the age, but to me, if you look at most other countries that have a citizenship requirement, whether it's Switzerland or England, they make sure you want your as a right of citizenship, you should be able to communicate in one of our national languages.
And I think a majority of Canadians would agree with that, right?
Yep.
So, and in your example, I think that for somebody who speaks a stilted kind of English, can he get through the day in Vancouver or wherever he lives with that stilted English? I think that's what most people want.
Well, can he get through enrichment through the day?
Well, that's story, right?
That becomes the question, right?
Yeah.
Where he lives, right?
Well, apparently he can. He's been here 12 years.
Yeah, he does very well, it sounds like. He's moving along. All right, we want to change now to, I'm sure what a big part of your firm's work is employer compliance. So with employer compliance, these are, give me an example of what you would be dealing with that sort of stuff.
Well, employer compliance comes in a lot of respects. So there are new provisions that came, and it's a wide variety of employee compliance issues now. But when somebody hires a foreign worker, often they have to get what's called a labor market impact assessment. So they have to advertise, show that they can't find a Canadian to do the job, and then they sign a bunch of attestations when they're coming to Canada. The employer does, saying, I'm going to continue to work for, try and find Canadians to do this job. I'm going to make sure the foreign worker gets paid what he's supposed to get paid, and I'm going to abide by all these other things that were in the contract that I promised, right? Up until December 15th of last year, when the Canadian government had an opportunity to investigate people, but the only way that they could punish them was publishing them on a banning list, right? That banning list, literally, I think the last time I checked it had maybe 4 companies on it. So we have in Canada at any given time about 150,000 foreign workers every year come in, and only 4 companies have been found in violations so severe that they were written up. There were no financial penalties at all. December 15th, we started to see that there can now be financial penalties. And so this is very serious for employees, and they've got to be aware of it. They've got to be aware that they have a lot of obligations that they've agreed to under this. So one of the big obligations, for example, is keeping records, right? So they have to keep records, and they have to keep records for a long time. They've got to keep records for, you think about how long you've got to keep your tax records.
7 years, yeah.
You've got to keep your employee records now for every foreign worker you hire for 6 years. So that's, if you have one foreign worker, it's not so bad. If you have a lot, you've got a massive evidentiary requirement, and that's a violation in itself that you could get a fine for if you haven't kept those records for 6 years. So a lot of employers aren't aware of these things.
We're going to take a quick break. We're going to pick it up where you have to finish off on employer compliance, and we have lots to talk about. I think you referenced in there the LMIA, right?
Yeah.
That's what's a long form?
Labor market impact assessment.
Right. So we'll find out about that and more when we continue on The Law Show. We're talking about immigration law with MKS next on CIAL.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIAL 650.